There was a dollar store toy on my daughter's birthday table for almost an hour before anyone said anything about it. A plastic ring, the kind that comes in a clear bubble on a cardboard hook, the kind you find in a bin by the checkout line next to the gum. My mother set it down next to the cake like it belonged there. And when my daughter looked up, confused, still holding the ring in her small hand, my mother leaned close to her ear and said the sentence I have turned over in my mind every day since. Don't expect more than this. Not from us. Get used to it now. I want to tell this story in order, because the order is the only thing that makes any of it make sense. If I start with the party, you'll think this is a story about a mean grandmother and a hurt little girl, and it is that, but it isn't only that. It took me the better part of a year to understand what I actually witnessed that afternoon, and I was wrong about most of it for a long time. So I'm going to start further back, before Ren was born, before I even knew what kind of mother I would turn out to be, because you need to understand who my parents were before you can understand what they did. My name is Mara. I'm 34. I live in a small city in Ohio, the kind with one real downtown street and a lot of strip malls, and I work as a physical therapist at a clinic that mostly sees older patients recovering from hip replacements and knee surgeries. I chose that work, I think now, because I have always been drawn to people who are trying to get their bodies to do something they used to be able to do without thinking about it. There's a kind of patience required for that work. You cannot rush someone's tendons. You cannot yell a hip back into alignment. You just show up, week after week, and you do the quiet, repetitive work, and eventually, if you're lucky, something loosens. The tension, if you want to call it that, was never a single dramatic event. It was smaller than that, and slower, which is why I kept explaining it away for years instead of naming it. It was my mother remembering Caleb's daughter's shoe size and forgetting Ren's twice in one conversation. It was a Christmas where Caleb's kids got a full set of matching bicycles and Ren got a coloring book, and my mother saying, when I brought it up gently, that money was tighter than it used to be, though nothing about the bicycles suggested that. It was small enough, every time, that saying something out loud would have made me the unreasonable one. My husband noticed before I let myself notice. I remember him saying, quietly, after one Thanksgiving, that he thought my mother treated our daughter like an obligation she was fulfilling rather than a person she loved, and I remember getting defensive, telling him he didn't understand the family, that this was just how my mother was, that it wasn't personal. I believed that, mostly, because believing anything else meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. There is one scene from that stretch of years that I keep returning to, maybe because it was the first time someone outside the family said out loud what I had been too close to see clearly. My friend Priya came to Ren's 4th birthday, because her own daughter was in Ren's class. She pulled me aside near the drinks table, while my mother was across the yard handing Caleb's daughter a wrapped bicycle helmet and matching gloves, careful and considered, the kind of gift you plan for weeks, and asked me, quietly, whether my mother liked Ren. I laughed it off, the way I laughed off most things back then, and said of course she does, she's just not a very demonstrative person. Priya brought it up again a year later, more directly, and asked if I'd ever noticed the pattern myself, out loud, to anyone. I hadn't. Or I had, in the specific unspoken way you notice a draft in a house you've lived in your whole life, you feel the cold, you put on a sweater, you never ask where it's coming from. I kept inviting them anyway. I want to be honest about why, because I think it's the part of this story people understand least from the outside. It would have been easier, in some ways, to simply stop. But I had this stubborn, half-conscious hope that if I just kept the door open long enough, kept showing up long enough, something would soften that hadn't softened for me. I told myself I was doing it for Ren, so she would have grandparents, so she wouldn't grow up with the particular kind of absence I'd grown up feeling even in a full house. I think that was partly true. I think the other part of it was that some younger version of me was still trying to earn something I had never quite earned, and I was doing it now through my daughter without fully admitting that to myself. There was a specific object that became, over those years, a kind of quiet marker of all this, though I didn't understand it as a symbol until much later. My father had a habit, every time he visited, of bringing Ren a small paper bag from the hardware store, a spool of colored twine, a tiny box of nails she wasn't allowed to touch, but loved to shake, a paint chip card she'd use as a bookmark. It cost him nothing, materially, but he always presented it like it mattered, crouching down to her level, telling her what each item was for. My mother never brought anything like that. She brought cards with money folded inside, addressed correctly, delivered a little formally, like a transaction being closed out. There was a night, about a year before the party, when Desmond and I sat down and talked about whether to keep trying at all. It was after a Sunday dinner where my mother had spent 20 minutes helping Caleb's wife plan a nursery for their second baby, color swatches spread across our kitchen table, while Ren sat a few feet away building something out of blocks that nobody asked her about. In the car afterward, Desmond asked me, carefully, what I thought we were actually hoping would happen. I didn't have a clean answer. I told him I thought if we just gave it enough time, enough good dinners, something in my mother would finally unclench. He didn't argue, but he said hope wasn't a strategy, it was just a feeling, and feelings didn't reliably change other people's behavior no matter how long you held on to them. I told him I knew that. I kept holding onto it anyway. Some part of me needed to prove, to some younger version of myself standing in that same childhood kitchen, that if I just did it right this time, the outcome could be different for my daughter, even if it never had been for me. The birthday in question was Ren's 6th. We'd rented the community room at the library, because Ren had asked, very specifically, for a party where everyone could hear her read her favorite book out loud before the cake, and the library let us use the room for free on Saturday afternoons. It was a small party, a handful of her friends from kindergarten, my husband's sister and her kids, my parents, Caleb and his family. I remember feeling, that morning, a small unfamiliar lightness. My mother had called the week before to ask what Ren wanted, which she had never done before, and I let myself believe that maybe this was the year something shifted. The gifts were opened at the little table near the window. Caleb's kids had gotten Ren a real dollhouse, elaborate, clearly expensive, and Ren had squealed and hugged them both. Desmond's sister had brought a stack of books Ren had specifically asked for. And then my mother stepped forward with a small plastic bag from the pharmacy checkout aisle, the kind you don't even need a bag for, and inside it was the ring. A single dollar store plastic ring, still on its cardboard backing, the kind of thing you'd get as a party favor, not a birthday gift. Ren, to her enormous credit, tried to be gracious about it the way we had taught her to be gracious about gifts. She said thank you. She held it up. And it was in that moment, while she was still holding it up, still smiling in that determined 6-year-old way, that my mother leaned in and said it, quietly, meant for Ren's ears, but loud enough that I heard every word from 3 feet away. Don't expect more than this. Not from us. Get used to it now. I have replayed that sentence more times than I can count. What strikes me now, and what didn't strike me in the moment, because I was too busy feeling like the floor had opened under me, is how strange the phrasing was. Not from us. As though she were speaking not just for herself, but for some larger, settled policy. As though this were a decision that had already been made somewhere else, a long time before that afternoon, and she was simply the one delivering the notice. I didn't make a scene. I want to be honest about that too, in the moment. I did the thing I had been trained my whole life to do, which was to smooth it over. I laughed a little, too brightly, said something about how Ren loved rings, thank you Grandma, and moved everyone toward the cake. It wasn't until that night, after the party, after Ren was asleep with the plastic ring still on her finger, because she'd refused to take it off, that I let myself feel what had actually happened. Desmond found me in the kitchen an hour after we'd put her to bed. I hadn't cried yet. I was just standing there, doing dishes that didn't need doing, and he asked, gently, if I wanted to talk about it, and I said no, and then I talked about it for 2 hours anyway. He didn't try to fix it, or explain it away this time. He just said, at one point, that whatever this was, it wasn't about Ren, and it probably wasn't fully about me either, and that we didn't have to figure out what it was that night. He was right about that last part, though it took me nearly a year to actually stop trying to figure it out that same week. I called my mother 2 days later. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, what she meant. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised me, not an apology, not an explanation, just a flat, tired statement, that she thought it was better for children to learn early not to expect things, so they wouldn't be disappointed later. I asked her if that was what she'd wanted for me. She didn't answer that question. She changed the subject to whether I was coming for Easter. I told her, for the first time in my life, no. Not this year. I told her I needed some distance to think, and I hung up before she could turn it into something I had to manage for her. My father called an hour later, and I could tell from his voice that he was somewhere between the two of us, not defending her exactly, but not willing to say anything against her either. Give her time, he said. She's been different since the fall. I asked what he meant by different. He said it wasn't his place to say, and that was the end of that conversation. For the next several months, we didn't see them. It was the longest stretch of silence in my adult relationship with my parents. Caleb called a few times, awkwardly, clearly appointed as an emissary, saying things like Mom didn't mean it like that and you know how she gets, and I found myself, for the first time, not accepting those translations on her behalf. I told him I loved him, and that this wasn't about relitigating our whole childhood, but that I wasn't going to keep bringing my daughter somewhere she was told not to expect love. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think he'd ever heard it stated so plainly before, even though I suspect some version of it had been true for both of us for a long time. It was my Aunt Ruth, my mother's older sister, who finally told me the thing that changed how I understood all of it. She called in late spring, ostensibly to ask about Ren, but I could tell within a few minutes that she'd actually called to talk about my mother. She asked, carefully, if I knew about Eleanor. I didn't. I had never heard the name before in my life. Ruth told me that before I was born, before my parents had even been married 2 years, my mother had given birth to a daughter who lived 4 days. Eleanor. There had been no NICU in their town then worth the name, no real support, and my mother had gone back to work at the store within 2 weeks, because my father said they couldn't afford for her not to, and nobody in that family, Ruth said, ever spoke about it again. Not at holidays, not at funerals, not once in 30 years. My mother had been told, by her own mother, that dwelling on it wouldn't bring the baby back, and she should be grateful for what she had. Ruth said she thought my mother had built her whole adult life around a private, unspoken rule, that you did not let yourself expect too much of anything, because expecting was what made the losing unbearable. She said she thought my mother genuinely believed, in some buried way, that she was protecting Ren by lowering the ceiling early, the way you'd brace a shelf before it could fall on its own. I sat with that for a long time, before I said anything to Ruth. It didn't excuse what had happened at the party. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy to hear this and think the story is now about forgiving my mother completely, and it isn't, not yet, maybe not ever fully. But it did something else. It moved the sentence from being only cruelty into being cruelty with a source, and there is a difference, even if the difference doesn't undo the harm. I asked Ruth why my father had never told me any of this. She said she didn't think he knew how. She said my father had grieved Eleanor differently, quietly, alone, in the way men of his generation, in that town were taught to grieve, which mostly meant not grieving where anyone could see it. She said she thought the paper bags from the hardware store, the little rituals with Ren, were his own private answer to something he'd never said out loud either. I hadn't thought of it that way before. I had thought of my father's small gifts as just his personality. I began to wonder, after that call, if there was something closer to penance, or correction, offered in the only language available to him. I went to see my father alone a few weeks later, without my mother there, at the hardware store on a slow Tuesday afternoon. I asked him directly about Eleanor. He didn't deny it or deflect the way he usually did with hard things. He got very quiet, and then he told me, in maybe 4 sentences total, about the 4 days. He said her hand had been smaller than his thumb. He said he still thought about what color her eyes would have turned out to be. Then he changed the subject, the way he always did, but this time I understood that the changing of the subject was itself the grief, not an avoidance of it. Before I left, he went to the back of the store and came out with a small envelope. Inside it were savings bonds, purchased a few at a time over 6 years, made out in Ren's name. He told me he'd been buying them since she was born, a little each month, never mentioning it to anyone, not even to my mother. He said he didn't know why he'd never told me. I think he did know, actually. I think it was easier for him to love her in a register nobody could see or question or ration, the same way it had apparently been easier for my mother to withhold in a register that felt, to her, like protection. I asked him, standing there with the envelope in my hands, why he'd never once mentioned it. He thought about it before answering. He said that if he'd told anyone, it would have started to feel like a performance, and he wanted it to just exist quietly, the way some good things are allowed to exist without an audience. He said the day of the party, he'd sat in his car in the library parking lot for almost 20 minutes before driving home, because he hadn't known what to say to my mother, or to me, or to himself. I asked why he hadn't stopped her in the moment, right there at the table. He looked at me and said he wished, more than almost anything in his life, that he had. He said he'd spent 30 years learning how to be quiet in that house, and it turned out that particular skill was not always a virtue. That was the closest my father has ever come, in my hearing, to an apology that wasn't really his to give. I want to be honest that this discovery didn't undo the sentence my mother said at that party. It didn't make the plastic ring into something other than what it was in that moment, which was cruel, whatever its roots. But it did complicate the story I'd been telling myself, which was that my mother simply didn't love my daughter. I think now that she loved her in a frightened, damaged way, filtered through a loss she'd never been allowed to properly carry, and that my father loved her in a silent, compensatory way, filtered through the same loss, arriving at nearly opposite behavior from the same wound. I did not go back to unlimited visits with my mother. I want to say that plainly, because I don't want this story to end the way these stories sometimes do, with a full and easy reconciliation that erases what happened. I told her, in a conversation that took place on my porch in early summer, that I understood some of where the sentence had come from now, and that I was sorry for what she had lost, sincerely sorry, in a way I hadn't been able to be before I knew. But I told her that understanding the source didn't mean Ren would be exposed to it again without protection. I told her visits going forward would be shorter, supervised in the sense that I would always be in the room, and that if anything like that happened again, there would be no more visits at all. She didn't argue. She cried, which I had seen maybe twice in my life before that day. She said she didn't expect me to just move past it. I told her I wasn't moving past it. I was moving around it, carefully, the way you walk around something on the floor you don't trust yet to hold your weight. Before she left the porch that evening, she said one more thing I hadn't expected. She said that when she looked at Ren, sometimes, especially at moments like a birthday, something in her simply seized up, some old alarm she'd never learned how to silence, telling her not to watch a child be celebrated too openly, because openness like that was where the losing got in. She said she knew that made no sense out loud, that it wasn't Ren's fault or mine, and that she wasn't asking me to forgive it, only to know it wasn't really about the ring at all. I told her I believed her. I told her believing her was not the same as being willing to let it happen again in front of my daughter. She said she understood. I don't know, even now, whether she fully does. It was the first time in my life she had ever tried to explain herself to me instead of simply issuing a verdict, and for a woman who had kept a ledger instead of a conversation for 3 decades, that was not nothing. My father's relationship with Ren didn't need the same repair, but it changed anyway, in a way I hadn't expected. He started telling her, in small pieces appropriate to a 6-year-old, about Eleanor, not the grief of it, but the fact of her, the way you'd introduce a great-aunt she'd never met. Ren, in her way, absorbed this without drama, the way children absorb most things, and began asking, periodically, what Eleanor would have been like as a big cousin. I think my father needed someone to ask him that question more than he ever let on. Ren still has the plastic ring. It sits, oddly, in a small box on her dresser next to a rock she found on vacation, and a feather she is convinced is magic. I asked her once, gently, if she remembered anything about the day she got it, worried the sentence had lodged somewhere in her the way it had lodged in me. She said she remembered Grandma seemed sad that day. That was all she'd kept from it. Children file things by feeling before they file them by fact, and I have never been more grateful for that particular mercy. I used the bonds, eventually, along with what my father had already set aside, to start a small account for Ren's education, and I told her, when she's older, the whole story, not to burden her with it, but because I think the sentence deserves an ending that isn't just silence, the way the 4 days of Eleanor's life deserved more than 30 years of silence. I don't know yet exactly what I'll say. I know I won't tell it the way my mother would have. I know it will end with the fact that no one, in this family, going forward, gets told not to expect love. Whatever else has been broken and mended and broken again in the 3 generations before her, that much I intend to hold the line on. Plainly, without qualification, for as long as I'm the one holding the line. There was one more small scene, near the end of that summer, that I want to include, because it was the moment I understood the shape of things had actually changed. My mother came to Ren's end of kindergarten picnic, sitting a little apart the way she'd learned to now, and Ren ran over to show her a drawing, a lopsided sun with too many rays. My mother took it, looked at it for a long moment, and instead of saying something quick and closing, the way she always used to, she asked Ren to tell her about it, why that many rays, what the little dog in the corner was named. It was such a small thing. It would have meant nothing to a stranger watching. But I sat there on the picnic blanket and felt something in my chest unclench slightly, not trust exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that might one day hold trust, if it kept being fed carefully. I didn't say anything to her about it. Some changes do better without being narrated back to the person making them. I think about restraint a lot now, not the kind that keeps people from saying what they feel, which is the kind my family specialized in for most of my life, but the other kind, the kind that means choosing, deliberately, over and over, not to pass down a wound just because it was handed to you first. Love, it turns out, is not a fixed amount that gets thinner the more people ask for it. It only behaves that way in the hands of people who were taught, once, in 4 unbearable days, that it might be taken from them without warning. I understand that now. Understanding it doesn't erase what it cost. It just means I get to decide, for my daughter, that the account doesn't have to stay closed. If this story stayed with you, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more quiet, honest stories.